But welcome to our next webinar for the Oklahoma Transition Council. Thank you guys for joining us. This should be really good. So it is the next one that we have set up, and this is the culturally responsive transition practices presented by Andrea. I meant to ask you how to pronounce that, and I totally forgot.
It's okay, you nailed it.
It's yay!
You've got it, Jen.
Yay! Kimberly, Osmani, and Tracy, Sinclair. So again, I'm glad you guys are here with us. If you have a question, just put it in the chat feature, and we will get to you as soon as we can. We will also have poll questions every now and then. I think we have 2 more. I've forgotten how many I set up. So keep an eye on that, and that way we can get some feedback from you guys. Other than that, I'm just going to turn it over so they have more time to rock and roll.
Thanks, Jen. Could you go ahead and start recording, because I think we stopped it?
Nope. Yeah, it's going.
Okay, it's still going. Perfect. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. We're really excited to have you be a part of the Oklahoma Transition Council and the vast array of webinars that we've been offering for more than a year now. We're really excited to be able to reach out and provide these opportunities that we hope you all feel are beneficial and useful in your work. I do want to remind everybody that our next webinar, and I'll repeat this at the end too, is on November 20th from 9:30 to 10:30 in the morning. And I believe it will cover information regarding addressing post-school outcomes and transition planning for students and youth who live in rural areas. I don't have the exact title, but I know that that's kind of the gist of it. And we are excited to let you know that we are in the development of planning the 15th annual Oklahoma Transition Institute, that as of right now, the dates that we're holding are September 28th, 29th, and 30th of 2020. So put a hold on your calendar and share the dates with your colleagues, and just be on the lookout for more information as we get that for you. Okay, so this morning we are going to talk about culturally responsive transition practices. I'm Kim Osmani. I am a doc student at the University of Oklahoma. I also am an extension associate with Cornell University, where I help staff a National Technical Assistance Center that focuses on working with voc rehab agencies and their partners in ensuring that opportunity youth populations that have disabilities, such as those in foster care, juvenile justice, those youth who've experienced homelessness, an array of others, are accessing VR services. Let's see, Andrea, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Andrea Sook, and like Jen said, it's like book, but Sook. I was a high school special education teacher in Illinois, Arizona, and Texas. And I'm currently finishing up my PhD at the University of Oklahoma in special education with a focus on transition and applied behavior analysis.
And I'm Tracy Sinclair. I also am a 4th-year doc student here at OU, along with Kim and Andrea. And prior to coming to OU, I taught high school special education in Tennessee, and prior to that, I taught kindergarten as a gen ed teacher in Michigan. So I've kind of spanned the gamut of public education settings. And I'm currently a BCBA, which is a board certified behavior analyst, and focusing on special ed, transition, and ADA here at OU.
And I'd like to just kind of get a feel of who's on today. We've got about 12 participants if you don't include us and Jen. Kind of get a feel for who's represented. Jen, do you have the results of that poll, or is it already closed?
I do. We've got 4 educators, 2 education administrators, 1 vocational rehabilitation counselor, 1 VR administrator or supervisor, and 6 others.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Could you go ahead and pull up the other poll too? We are curious how many of you participated in the previous webinar that we had on bias. There we go.
I guess I can share the results.
Yeah, look at that.
All right.
Okay, so there's the results of the first one. Awesome. Thank you.
All right, stop share. Okay, this one's on. Sorry, first time I've had to do a poll.
So if everybody could respond to the second poll question, we're just curious how many of you actually attended the previous webinar in this 3-part series that covered identifying and recognizing our own hidden bias. And Jen will need to see that result too. That should pop up pretty quickly.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I have to end polling. So I'll give it, I've got 11 to 15 that have voted. So far 2 said yes, 9 said no.
I was one of the 2.
Tell me when you guys want to end it.
I think you can end it now. Okay, so no problem. We just wanted to kind of gauge how many had been in attendance. So we're going to go ahead and get started so we can maximize the time that we have and share with you information about what it means to be culturally responsive and how to implement it in transition. So let me make sure I'm clicking in the right area. The objectives for today are to learn about what it means to be engaging in culturally responsive transition practices, to examine some questions that we can consider when we're engaging in such practices, and how such practices can help us develop post-secondary goals. So Andrea, Tracy, and I are splitting up this PowerPoint and presentation, and I'll do the first part, and then we'll transition over to the other presenters. And like Jen said, if you just joined us, please feel free to post any of your questions that you have in the chat function. So just to give a little bit of background information of why it's really essential that we be incorporating such practices is we have a diverse student population, not only in the United States, but when you pare it down more specifically and looking at the students that have been found eligible for special education and related services under IDEA, you start to see some numbers there as well that are reflective of our diverse cultures. So it's really important for us to be looking at our school district data, our VR data, whatever entity you represent, see who you're serving, and look at the broader areas of the areas that you live and work in to look at the population of that community and what different ethnic, religious, and cultural groups are represented, and see how we are reaching out and engaging those populations. So as you can see, for the students served under IDEA, we've got pretty consistent numbers of the groups. You do not see a huge, large number for the Caucasian population like you do for the overall US enrollment. And so we've got kind of an even span over there. But when you compare the numbers of the students that we're serving that are from diverse backgrounds, and you compare that with who's actually teaching them in our schools, the majority of public educators are Caucasian. 82% of public educators are Caucasian. And just to let you know, we have the links and references for all the information that we were able to gather through statistics and other research that you can access through the PowerPoint. And so keeping in mind the populations that we're serving, who's reflective of serving them, are we actually recognizing these cultural differences? And if so, how are we addressing them? And these are questions we want you all to leave today with in asking yourselves as you go into your day-to-day work, are we really being culturally responsive and inclusive in our work? And do we see a potential disconnect knowing that we have such a high rate of educators who are Caucasian serving a vast array of different cultural and ethnic populations? Could there be disconnects? And what can we do to identify these potential disconnects and help bridge these gaps? And that's what we hope to cover today with you. So what does it mean to be culturally responsive? We have a very short definition here for you. What it means is that we are developing, supporting, and fostering the post-school success that is grounded in individual student and familial cultural beliefs. And I know that we have several of you on here that are from diverse backgrounds, and welcome your input throughout as well. We can't always just focus on the student, and sometimes I think there is a disconnect between the federal laws that we have to work within and the goals that they have for the individuals we serve. For example, IDEA promoting further education, training, and employment, VOC Rehab and the Rehabilitation Act, excuse me, focusing on a competitive integrated employment outcome. And that may not be in alignment with a specific family's beliefs, cultural beliefs, or other structures within those groups. And so having conversations with the families and having conversations with the student, and when we say families, we're talking in the broad sense, because it may not necessarily be by blood, it may be a chosen family, extended family. And so that's what we encourage you to really be inclusive of those populations in your conversation, meetings, and planning, and focusing on these 4 areas of understanding the history and culture that you're working with, how you can bring that community and that culture into the classroom, either physically through the people from those cultures or through other activities that you can do to integrate within. And then, of course, the huge piece of family involvement, as we know, is a huge predictor of post-school success for students with disabilities. And then incorporating some of the native language and other values, beliefs, traditions into your classroom for the students that we're serving. So what we want to do now, we're going to ask you to use the chat function, and we want you to think about a time, and I'm going to open my chat before I forget so I can see the responses. When you think of your own personal culture, and this is each one of you, what are some words that come to mind when you think of your culture? They can be concepts, key ideas, icons, symbols, and we want each of you to think about 3 words or phrases that describe your culture. So for example, I'm from the American culture. So to me, I might think of democracy. I might think of the American eagle as a symbol of freedom. And I might think of, I'm going to say baseball. That's something that's, part of our American culture, and you grow up with that as a sport. So if you could all take just a minute here to think of 3 words or phrases to describe your culture. Conservative rural community, definitely the rural aspect, very different from urban settings with a more diverse group. Thank you for that. What are some other things that come to mind when you think of your own personal culture? And if you can't find the chat function on your Zoom screen on the top right, there's the word more with 3 dots above it. If you click on that, you'll see chat. Christian and family oriented, definitely bringing in the religious aspects and the various beliefs and how that influences your family, definitely. Again, family and religion. And in some cultures and in some religions, family plays a huge part. In others, it's we talk about the difference between collectivist and individualistic views. So that can definitely make a difference. Education, PFLAG, definitely. The Catholicism, aviation. Ooh, Carrie, I would love to know more about aviation. Definitely the gender and identity topics that we are experiencing in our adult world these days are very different than what our parents experienced, and probably very different than what our children will be experiencing in the future, and how that influences the work we do, definitely. And probably some generational differences within families that are experiencing that as well. Family education work. Jen, that sounds like me. That's definitely. Kendra mentions religion, the importance of education, having a good work ethic. I know many of us today talk about, the teens of today, or the millennials, or X-Gen and Z-Gen, and how different the work ethic is and what the expectations are. Middle class, opportunity, definitely playing a role there. Work ethic is coming across as a theme. Reading is being something important, and being resilient. So you can see, like, we have commonalities across all of our different, whether it's a religious, a culture, an ethnic culture, a rural versus urban, whatever the case may be, or even just beliefs and values within a family outside of those things, and how they influence our work, they influence our day-to-day operations. And so we have the commonalities, but we also have some differences. And so just in what we've seen here in the chat, we can consider the experiences that the students we're serving are experiencing, I hate to use that word twice, sorry, within the classrooms that we're serving, and how their thoughts, their actions, their decisions are all influenced by those things. And so how do we take those, how do we incorporate them? How do we have family conversations around these key issues? So thank you, everybody, for participating and responding to that. A little bit about personal culture, to kind of reflect on that, is when we are able to look at our own culture, that's really our first step in being able to understand another cultural perspective. And there's some really neat things out there. If you do some research about what are American values, or what is common American cultural beliefs and indicators, and being able to look at those and compare them to some others, it really is an eye-opening experience. So once we can do that with our own, we can start to be reflective as an individual. And when we can do that, then we're taking the steps toward really being culturally responsive. And as we all know, it's not something that we can do and change and become fully immersed in overnight, but it does take, it takes intentional effort to get there. So we're going to just talk about one brief example. Oh, and I see Rachel added, sorry, Rachel. Community activities, often with food involved, definitely. Specific games, dances, ceremonies, beliefs that are related to a particular tribe. Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you're on here, and I saw that you were registered. So thank you for definitely bringing that, the Native American and tribal voice into that. And that's going to be an example that we're going to share. So if there's anything, Rachel, that you would want to add in this example, you feel free to unmute. But we're going to just look at one specific cultural example to just see how the beliefs are in the Native American culture, and how it might differ from the cultures that you all are experiencing personally, but also within the systems that you work. So for example, in the Native American culture, some of the strong values are in the areas of the kinship and extended family, under shared responsibilities and benefits, and under spirituality. We could probably add another one there, right, with Rachel, with food. But under the kinship and extended family, and how this impacts us in our work, think about how that would affect your meetings that you have, and the decisions that need to be made and may not be able to be made if not everybody can be at the table, especially if it's beyond just the parents and that student. And so there is that involvement and the respect and high regard for elders in the community and getting their input. And so that's something that would need to be considered. And then under shared responsibilities and benefits, there is the value, attitude, and behavior that mutualism is infused in the traditional Indian society. Mutualism is something that promotes that sense of belonging and that solidarity within that group, to be able to feel secure in that group and to gain consensus within that group. And then finally, the spirituality, we're getting into the religious aspect of it, where religion is infused in everything, and it is in every action, in every aspect of their life, and probably is what is reflected in the dances, the games, the ceremonies that Rachel mentioned. And so it is just a natural component of everything within the Native American culture. And so that is very different than many other cultures, especially if you were to just look at, say, the typical U.S. American culture, when you look at some of the other things, it's very much of an achievement and individual kind of, there's an aspect of value around that. But we are a very diverse country, and that is definitely, I think, changing and evolving over time as we get more diverse. So thank you all for your contributions in there. We just wanted to get that example, and I am going to turn it over to Tracy.
Hi everybody, this is Tracy. I'm a little bit further away from the computer, so if you can't hear me well, please just pop a note in the chat and I can speak up.
We hear you great.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So we found this image and we thought it was really relevant and important to talk about. When we're talking about culture, if we think back to what the words everybody typed into the chat function, I just jotted a few of them down. Words like religion, work ethic, family, middle class, opportunity, ceremonies, beliefs, dance. All of those things, some of those are visible things that we can see, but there's a lot of things that we can't see. And as educators and voc rehab personnel or administrators, we have to be really mindful of all of those things that are kind of below the surface. So if we're thinking about the obvious cultural differences that we may see between different ethnic groups or racial groups, we see things like food or festivals or dance or dress or language, and that is kind of the surface level. But the purpose of doing this webinar today too is to challenge everyone to go below the surface and really explore the elements of culture that really impact transition planning and supporting students in employment or post-secondary education settings, because they're not always visible. And we have to make a conscious effort to address those. So this activity that we did today with everybody here, that's a great activity to do with your students or clients that you're working with, talking about what are the words that describe your personal values, your personal culture. And it's really telling to see how we prioritize that. So some of us put religion first, some of us put education first, some of us put work ethic first. And so we can begin to have that conversation on a deeper level about what are the different elements of culture and how can I support you as an educator or voc rehab specialist with that transition to post-secondary settings. Thanks, Kim. I wasn't sure if I should say next. Would you prefer if I do that?
Either way.
Okay. So the next section of our webinar is going to focus on looking at culturally responsiveness in school settings. So we kind of touched on this a little bit in some of the things that Kim talked about, but being culturally responsive is really important in the transition planning process, because it's a shift in your thinking as an educator or voc rehab specialist to really value those resources that we can gain from a student or family's culture and use that as capital, as something that we can build upon, rather than seeing it as a barrier to learning or a barrier to post-secondary goals that we're trying to develop with the students. So here we gathered some tips together when we're thinking about meetings. And this applies whether you're an administrator in the voc rehab world or as an educator when you're developing an IEP plan for the meeting. So we need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence in preparation. So having an understanding of what our family culture is for that particular student, prior interactions that you've had with the family, how will that potentially affect a formal meeting? Being able to kind of gather knowledge about norms or taboos that may be part of a specific culture. Again, some of those things might be the more visible cultural differences. And so sometimes we have to seek out information from the families themselves. And there's nothing wrong with asking a family, what is their preference? Is your preference to have at a particular time of day, a particular day of week? Being mindful of respecting our family's time, the student's time, as well as our own. And it's really important for us as professionals to model to our students how to hold ourselves accountable and also how to be inclusive and include everybody's voice at the table. It's really important. The third tip focuses on making sure that we are implementing practices in our work environment, whether that be the school or in a community-based work setting, to support diverse ideas, diverse opportunities, and being inclusive at non-traditional modes of employment or education or potentially even living. As educators, in particular, I'm speaking from personal experience, education is obviously something that's very important to me. I'm in my PhD program now, and as a teacher, I always wanted to promote my students pursuing further education, further training. And sometimes I had to take a minute to step back and say, is this my agenda that I'm pushing, or am I supporting what my students actually need and want for their post-secondary goals? So that's really important that we kind of, like Kim said, check our own personal agenda and our own personal bias and address that before we involve students. When we're using language with our families, especially in meetings, especially IEP meetings, there is so much jargon and special ed language or slang. We throw around acronyms kind of like they're candy, that we have to be careful that we are making sure that our families understand what we're talking about. And then additionally, that under the layer surface of using kind of common slang or things that aren't necessarily grammatically correct, that are focused on similes and metaphors, those kind of figurative language pieces that as native English speakers, we kind of weave throughout our conversations, that we have to be mindful of that if we have families that English is a second language, that may cause some confusion or potentially be offensive because of the misunderstanding or the way that we're presenting certain concepts or language that we're using with families. And then the final tip there is just a reminder that we have to include our students and families in all aspects of the transition planning process. And we need to really co-lead and really take their lead in a lot of ways about decision-making, roles that are going to happen in the meeting, responsibilities, and then who's going to be accountable for following up on those post-secondary education goals. So this is kind of an extension of what we kind of were just talking about with those tips with meetings. When we are working with our students and clients, we also need to hold everybody accountable and also model that kind of practice. So when we're looking at classroom instruction or activities, that we're making sure that we're being as inclusive and diverse as possible. Some schools will often do a cultural diversity fair. I would just caution that sometimes when we do a one-off event, then it kind of takes away the fact that our culture is immersed in our lives every single day. So if we're going to do a one-off event, we have to make sure that we're still doing things regularly, daily, weekly, to make sure that we're honoring and focusing on diversity and different sorts of pieces of different students' cultures that we're working with. As professionals, you're doing the right thing right now. You're seeking out diversity training for yourself. In turn, you can translate this training into something you can do with your students or clients. Looking at local businesses, and if they have an HR person that can come out, and in the business world in particular, they receive a lot of training on diversity and inclusiveness and kind of cultural norms and taboos, especially for businesses that work internationally, because there are some things that we do stateside that outside of the United States would be considered offensive, and it's nothing that we're intentionally doing, but it's something we need to be aware of. And so having an outside person come in as a guest speaker can be a great opportunity for yourself to learn, as well as your students or clients. And then making sure that you are looking at the student's family, their circle of friends, the community as a whole, to find ways to develop deeper connections with that culture as a whole, so that it's not just a one-off diversity fair, that we're really infusing those culturally responsive practices in our daily or weekly instruction. We also want to make sure that we model for our students and involve our students in situations like role playing. So being able to practice greetings from various cultures, particularly for students who plan to travel abroad. A lot of us in this group mentioned religion was an important aspect of your personal culture. A lot of religious groups spend time overseas doing humanitarian work. And so if our students or clients are going to participate in those kind of events, we also have to make sure that they're familiar with the local culture of the country they're going to, so that they don't come into a country and again, incidentally offend someone or do something wrong, and then it could cause embarrassment or hurt feelings. So we have to be mindful of that as well. And as educators and professionals, and even just kind of as just general human beings, if there are cultural events happening in your area, a lot of them are free or low cost. Attending them, immersing yourself in the surrounding community and the culture so that you can learn from your students. And then it also shows your students that that's important to you. They see you at their local events. They see that you're taking a vested interest in something that is important to them, which is I think a great thing to make those relationships and connections with our clients and students. And then the last tip on the screen is focusing on looking at local businesses, restaurants or venues that we can provide exposure for our students to look for jobs, for the students to interview individuals that work there. How do they like working in that environment? How did they obtain that job? And just really a variety and a diverse amount of experiences and situations and different people just can help our students become more responsive themselves. So we also, circling back to some of the tips that Kim provided earlier, we have to be reflective in this process. And the reflection can be kind of uncomfortable at times, to sit down and really think about what personal bias you may or may not have. We all want to think, as professionals working with young adults and children, that we are open and inclusive, and we always are being mindful of differences. But just by the nature of our environments, we don't know everything. And so we have to recognize within ourselves and be reflective. Okay, for me personally, I mentioned this earlier, I thought it was really important to push my students to want to go to further education, whether that be a college setting, a technical school, and I needed to be careful about pushing my personal beliefs, because that was something that was really important to me growing up, that I didn't push that onto my students, and that if they wanted to work at the local daycare but not go get training before because it wasn't necessary, that was a 100% acceptable goal for that particular student. The second tip is to be open with families about your desire to learn about their cultures, and also to be considerate of their needs. So if there are language barriers, if there are needs that they have that you can accommodate, it's important to do so, in extending that kind of inquiry about their culture. A lot of times, families and students love to talk about specific traditions or cultural beliefs that they have. And it is an opportunity for you to learn, and an opportunity for that student and family to feel welcome and vested in the school community or in the worksite community as well. And we just kind of highlighted some important things that culturally tend to cause rifts between people on various levels for different reasons. Like, for example, assertiveness. In the general American culture, being assertive is seen as a very important skill. And at times that can come across as aggressive to certain people and to certain cultural backgrounds. Body language, eye contact, gestures. We've got a couple other things we're going to talk about, but those can sometimes come across as either aggressive, assertive, offensive. You know, there are people who love to hug, and if you go in for a hug and someone's expecting a handshake, that can definitely create an awkward situation. So talking to our clients and students about appropriate ways to approach new people, appropriate ways to use our body. I'm a hand talker. You can't see me. I'm trying to be better about it, but sometimes that can come across as kind of all over the place, and oftentimes maybe even a little bit aggressive, that I use my hands when I talk all the time. Making sure that we're not setting up dynamics when we meet with students and families where we kind of put ourselves in a position of power, because then that creates this dynamic where they have to kind of adhere to what we're saying in the meeting. We want to develop an environment where it's a team environment truly, so that we're sharing the space, we're sharing the amount of time that's talking, so that we don't create conflict between our students and our families. Silence can sometimes be something that can cause a level of discomfort, as well as time. In some cultures, time is kind of relative, and if something starts at 9:30, as long as you're there by 9:45, 9:50, you're still considered on time. And other cultures, if it starts at 9:30, you better be there at 9:15 or you're going to be considered late. So now we're going to talk about different ways that we can implement some of these culturally responsive practices and actions. We don't have time to explore this with y'all today, but these are two websites that are really great, and you can use on your own time to explore your own personal thoughts and feelings about culture and bias and just culture in general. So we just wanted to highlight just a few different things that we have learned in this process of developing the webinar, and some of the other things that we have done together as a group. But in China, business cards are typically exchanged at the start of meeting, and they usually use two hands when they do a handshake. Typically, entertainment is not done in the home, and so if they're going to have even a friendly meeting, it's going to be done at a community site or a restaurant. It's not going to typically be done in the home. Whereas in America, oftentimes homes are kind of a central space for entertainment, even for business entertainment. A lot of times, you know, the boss will have families over for a Christmas party or a holiday event, something like that. So we would need to make sure that if we had a family that was rooted in that culture, and they have just recently moved from China, in an IEP meeting, if we knew this information, we could potentially exchange business cards at the beginning of the meeting. We could use a typical handshake that is used in China versus the one-handed handshake that we use typically here in America. Or sometimes, a lot of times at IEP meetings, there's no handshakes at all. So maybe making it a little bit more formal, because overall in Chinese culture, it's a little bit more formal when you have a meeting with someone. And so thinking about, we have lots of students or clients that we sometimes meet with them at the home because they are homebound, or a family member is homebound, and that's the only way to be able to include them in the IEP planning process. We'd have to be mindful of this difference between American culture and Chinese culture, because in America, I've been to many students' homes. I've gone to students' homes to administer assessments, hold IEP meetings, even just gather a signature, and that potentially could be seen as overstepping from a family that comes from the Chinese culture. So in Brazil, oftentimes having loud conversations and very strong opinions is customary, and it's not seen as argumentative, and it's not seen as offensive. And so we, as Americans, oftentimes we kind of tiptoe around things that strong opinions occur. And so we should be mindful of that, because we may have families that come into the meeting very loud, very boisterous, with very strong opinions, and we have to be careful about that. And in Brazil, thumbs up is considered a vulgar gesture. So if we had a family that we knew was from the Brazilian culture, we would need to be mindful of that. Similar to, in Great Britain, our equivalent of the peace sign is the equivalent of the middle finger. So being mindful of those things, that doesn't mean that we're not going to make mistakes, because you may not know that the family comes from Brazil when you meet a family for the first time. And you might be just kind of looking at a kid down at the end of the table to try to ease them in that situation and give a thumbs up, like, hey, I got you, buddy, and not even realizing that you could potentially be doing something vulgar to your future client or student. So you have to be kind of mindful of that. And then there's just some questions for you to kind of consider. And again, in this process of being reflective and thinking about your own personal bias, these questions are a great opportunity for you or your colleagues to explore together as a group and have a group discussion about, if I have a student who does have very strong opinions and is kind of loud and out there about that, how can I incorporate that as a strength in the IEP? Thinking about skills of self-advocacy and how students speak up for themselves, and the student could potentially be a role model for other students who potentially don't have those skills of self-advocacy. In Dubai, the most common form of greeting is a handshake. And women still tend to have more submissive kind of body language. They'll cross their arms as a sign of respect if they're not comfortable shaking a man's hand, which is pretty common in this culture as well. So if we know that we have a family who is recently in our country and we go to shake hands with someone, oftentimes when we think of in the American culture, when you cross your arms, oftentimes that's kind of a sign of I'm closing myself off to you. I don't want to participate in the situation, or even that potentially I'm upset or angry. And so this knowledge would help us know that, in fact, this family member isn't upset. They're actually showing a sign of respect because they're just not quite comfortable in that situation yet. And that kind of can really shift the thinking if you have a meeting with families. If you're thinking, oh my goodness, this person is really angry and upset with me because they're sitting with their arms crossed, when in fact they're showing a significant amount of respect for you. This is kind of a neat graphic. And when we mentioned thumbs up, we mentioned the peace sign. And these are all of the different ways that hand gestures can be seen offensively across the world. So, sometimes it makes you think about, maybe I shouldn't use my hands when I'm talking to someone for the first time until I gauge potentially who they are, where they come from. They can gauge who I am and where I come from. Just like when, you meet someone for the first time, you kind of gauge their level of comfort with language. Do you call someone, Miss Sinclair, or is she going to introduce herself as Tracy in the IEP meeting? And different educators and voc rehab specialists have different amounts of expectation on that as well. So this is something just kind of to highlight all the different ways that you can say up yours. There's quite a few, as well as some other unknown things, like I didn't know that the kind of like, I'm probably dating myself a little bit, but the like rock on Beavis and Butthead sign down there at the bottom means something very, very different in Italy and Argentina, than it does here at a rock concert in the United States. And so when we highlighted those important cultural beliefs in the beginning. So we highlighted assertiveness, body language, gestures. So here are some questions to consider when you maybe you're having a conversation with a family about their culture, or even just as an educator, just to be mindful of these things. That self-advocacy for some cultures doesn't look like loud in your face, insisting on things that they need. Sometimes it's quieter and it can be a little bit more passive, and that doesn't mean that they're not being self-advocates. But we can also foster how to do that appropriately so that they're heard, so they're not ignored. And body language and gestures, again, this is a great opportunity to talk to your students or clients about offensive gestures. And let's be honest, young adults and teenagers would probably love if you said, are there any things in your culture that I shouldn't do with my hands? Because they can probably want to show you. And then it's like their one opportunity to show you something that you should never do. And then you gain knowledge, and the student also feels like they're teaching you something. Communication styles and direction. So how direct are you with a family or a student can really change the dynamics of a meeting. So we need to make sure that we are aware of who's in the meeting, what are the family dynamics, and who is receiving the bulk of the conversation. And then also thinking about disagreements. How do we address disagreements? Some cultural backgrounds don't want to address it in person verbally. They would prefer to kind of spend some time and then maybe address it later on. So it's really important that we think about those things, because oftentimes in the IEP meetings, disagreements and communication can break down, and so we need to be mindful of that. And eye contact, again, direct eye contact, is it socially acceptable or not? In some cultures, it's kind of seen as a challenge to authority. And in others, it's a sense of respect. Especially here in the kind of dominant American culture here, we expect eye contact from our clients and students. And the lack of eye contact can be seen as a sign of disrespect, but that's not necessarily the case. And again, the family structure. In some cultures, just like when we talked about like females in Dubai crossing their arms as a sign of respect in deferment to kind of the male. Again, in some cultures, there are still very gender-specific power dynamics going on. And sometimes it's the females that hold more power as a matriarchy versus the patriarchy.
Sorry, I was trying to respond to Jen in the poll, and my cursor was still on the slide, so it moved. Yeah, so Carrie has a good question in there, and it's a very relevant question and often comes up. And where is the bridge between teaching self-advocacy to a student in a culturally responsive way in order for them to be protected living within an American culture? Oh, hang on, I gotta go back to it because it moved as people typed. As an individual with a disability potentially entering the workforce or simply living in a group home. Because our models for teaching self-advocacy is very, very American. I think that's a great question. I'll do a quick response, and then Tracy and Andrea, if you guys want to add in. I think that's where a big question for the family comes in about what independence looks like for that individual, and knowing what those post-school environments are going to be, and talking about safety and security within those environments, and teaching you can teach self-advocacy without teaching them to be aggressive, directive, and disrespectful, if you want to say that, to whether they're able to make certain decisions within their own families and cultures. So I don't know if Tracy or Andrea want to add anything.
Yeah, I think that was a great response. And I also think too that being a self-advocate can look different. So you may not feel comfortable verbally advocating for yourself, but you might feel comfortable sending an email. And so being able to also explore the different ways that you can stand up for yourself and request the things that you need. And I think it also is completely appropriate to say, in our country, the dominant culture has this expectation. That doesn't mean that you have to have the same level of assertiveness, for example, but just know that others around you, especially if they're from the dominant culture, may expect that. And so being mindful of where you kind of lie in that spectrum of what self-advocacy looks like, because even though we're different on some way, we have to be mindful of how other people are going to perceive those practices too.
Okay, so are we turning it over to Andrea?
We are.
Andrea, 10 minutes.
Thank you. One more, please. Thanks. All right. So I just absolutely loved listening to Tracy talk about the differences from China, Brazil, Dubai. And just a quick shout out, if you were really intrigued, and we know there's so many other different cultures out there, the Condé Nast Traveler has a website that is Etiquette 101. Please check it out, because that's where we pull all that wonderful information from. So if you know that you have a student coming into your classroom, take a look at that. So now we want to move on, that we have all this great knowledge. How do we actually implement it during the transition planning process? First, when we make transition goals, we really want to consider the specifics of each student's family, each student themselves, and how the structure, the responsibilities, the expectations they and others have for them, the living situation, their values, beliefs, and even the spirituality of the student and their whole family network. We have to put all of this in context for every single one of our students. Specifically, when we think of living, learning, and earning, aka education, employment, and independent living, what is the family's perspective? What is the student's perspective? And what are the educator's perspectives and any other related services perspectives? Everyone should come to the table to be able to share what they think will happen in the future. And when we can identify that, we can start looking at what are the needs of the student, what are the needs of the family, and how do the roles of the student and the family play together, so that way we can have a collaborative discussion and make a plan that is going to be supported by all the stakeholders who are involved. So let's take a look at some examples. The first one deals with education. As you can see at the top of the screen, we have the post-secondary education goal example, and that's what the student will do after they graduate. And then we have the annual transition goal, which is the mini step to get them to that big, broader post-secondary step. So as you can see, this student has the goal that they will be an intern with an elder in the area of their choice to meet their employment goal in the local community. And to get there, they're going to create a weekly calendar with days and times that don't conflict with their family responsibilities, but where they can attend trainings through a state job center. Let's take a look at the next one on employment. So the one on employment would be, after high school, the student will be employed in a chosen field to assist his or her tribe and family. That's the big, broad goal that the whole team agreed to and collaborated on. And the mini annual goal to get to that one is, within one academic year, the student would create a list of 10 questions to ask elders or previous interns of that elder about a career choice, about the challenges and the successes. And they're going to share these questions and the responses with the case manager. So it facilitates that conversation, sharing of knowledge, and to help, again, solidify that plan. Let's look at the very last one on independent living. This one is, after high school, the student will assume responsibility for a share of living expenses by saving money earned and following a budget set by the parents. Now, this again was agreed to by all stakeholders, but it could be a budget set by the entire family or a budget set by the tribe. Or if you have someone that's like moving out, it could be a budget set by themselves. So again, we're really focusing on that shared piece of what we all agree to when we come to the table. And the annual goal to meet that is to practice creating that calendar showing the dates of times of when these expenses are due. So this way we know when the payments are coming at us, right? I wish I had to do this probably. All right, let's go to the next slide. So now it's our turn. I know we have just a couple of minutes left, but do we have any volunteers who are willing to try the chat box and create a post-secondary goal, an annual goal, or coordinated activity all together, either for yourself or for a student that you might work with? I'll give everybody just a moment to type those in. And while you're typing, I will share one with you based from our upcoming publication and transition and practice journal. So our example is the post-secondary goal is after graduation, Alejandra will be competitively employed at a family's horse ranch. The annual goal was within one academic year, Alejandra will identify and communicate 3 criteria related for more responsibility with 100% accuracy. Hint, hint, that is so Alejandra knows how to get a raise or move up in positions at her family's ranch. And then the coordinated set of activities could be learning about the Ticket to Work program to determine if her family's ranch can be a provider. So we really try to tie all of those together and be respectful that Alejandra really wants to work with horses, but she has a responsibility and a family value to still participate within the family's business. And we created and connected all of those together. So I would love to see some of your examples in the chat box. And looking at our time, if you have any questions, now would also be a good time to ask them. Carrie, thanks for the thumbs up. That's so reinforcing for us. I appreciate that. Here's our contact information. So if you have any questions or concerns, or if you have more specific examples that you would like to share with us that we can then modify and adapt for future presentations, we would absolutely love it. And on behalf of Kim, myself, and Tracy, thank you so much for attending this session and spending the hour with us. We hope that you learned a lot about being culturally responsive and how to use this in your settings and to be transition planning in the best possible way for your students.
And just a reminder to everybody that the next webinar, which is the last in this 3-part series for this series, is on November 20th at 9:30 in the morning, and the title is Facilitating Positive Post-School Outcomes for Individuals with Disabilities from Rural and Impoverished Areas. So hits upon some of the cultures that were indicated in the chat box in which you're working with. So we would encourage you to register for that webinar. If there are resources that you have on these topics that you want to share with the broader community, you can email them to Jen. Her email is here on the slide, Jennifer with 1 N, .randall@okdhs.org. Or you can call her and talk to her about it. If you have thoughts on this webinar or other information that you're seeking on topics similar to this, or would like an expanded training on this, either virtually or in person, please let us know. Jen, any final thoughts?
This is Andrea. I have one more resource to share. There are 4 Oklahoma towns that are going to be hosting a casting call for a new FX show called Reservation Dogs. So if you know anybody who is Native American and is interested in sharing their stories and the history, please reach out. The publication is in the OU Daily, and so they are definitely looking for people to tell some good stories on their history and their knowledge of the legacy from their tribes. And again, that's through the OU Daily, and it's a casting call for Reservation Dogs is what the FX show will be called.
Awesome.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. And I will be sending out a link to the survey, as well as it was in the email that you got the link. If you guys, once you complete that, and then I will send out certificates of attendance. Other than that, we're finished.
Thank you.